Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic, and today we are in video, which is new. You can tell me whether you like it or not. Probably won't influence whether I do it or not, but I'm happy to hear your opinions. Today we're going to talk about quantifier alternation, which is a subject that logic experts often think about, or at least have thought about in the past. I don't know if it's still an active area of research, but non-logic experts often, haven't really heard or understand what quantifier alternation is. People often talk about the arithmetic hierarchy or the analytic hierarchy. I'm only going to talk about the former. Roughly, analytic hierarchy and quantifier alternation mean the same thing. So we're going to look at arithmetic again, as we often do. And usually I just take the point of view of piano arithmetic because, it's this well-defined logic that we understand pretty well, and it can be used to illustrate all sorts of things. So in piano arithmetic, we have this classical logic. It allows us to say things about numbers, but as we've seen with encoding, you can say things about a lot of things, basically. Anything that can be encoded using numbers or sequences of strings or trees, all this can be encoded using piano arithmetic and using this these sort of well understood and somewhat straightforward encodings. Morally, logicians just think about that as a solved problem whenever they want to talk about something that's reasonable, like a string or some kind of data type. They just talk about piano arithmetic and don't bother to explain exactly how this gets encoded into numbers. So all I'm going to say pretty much applies to this, especially as it pertains to reasoning about programs and things like that. So classically, you have roughly 5 connectives: the universal, the existential, the and, the or, the implication. And maybe you have a few, other things like, false, but that could just be 0 equals 1 in arithmetic. Okay. What's kind of cool in classical logic is that you can basically separate these into 2 big groups: the quantifiers, the for all and the exists, which you can always move to the outside, right? Typically, you can say something like, for all x that is greater than 2, there is some y that is greater than 3, right? That's a for all x greater than 2 that is a for all on the outside, which is the opposite of the point I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make is, if you have a for all on the inside of a connective, right? If you have for all x, some predicate and some other thing, you can move that for all to the outside, right? For all x, every x is even, and 0 equals 0 is the same as for every x is even and 0 equals 0, right? You can push the for all outside. You can also do that for existentials, and you can do it outside of ands and ors. It's a little bit less obvious how to do that outside of implications. Basically, a for all on the left of an implication becomes an exists at the top level, and vice versa, which is kind of cool. This means that somehow the left hand side of an implication is like an invert operation. All right, all this is well known. This only sort of works in classical logic, but all these notions aren't too weird in in constructive logic. But I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm just going to talk about the classical case. So you can push all the quantifiers to the outside, and then on the inside you just have Boolean connectives and atomic senses like x equals y, or x plus 1 is less than 12. All right, you have all these inside things. What you definitely can't do, is invert a universal and an existential quantifier. You cannot do that. You can swap the universal quantifiers out, for all x, for all y, x equals y is the same as, for all y for all x. But you can't say if, for every x there is a y that is greater than x, right? That's a sentence that is true. You definitely can't swap those out and say there exists a y such that for all x, y is greater than x. That's false. That's saying there is a number that's bigger than every other number. And okay, so you can move these quantifiers out to the front, but you can't swap them. And so it seems kind of natural to now say, well, up to these sort of trivial logical equivalences, you have a bunch of quantifiers out in front, and that number of quantifiers seems not obvious. It is true that if you have two for alls, you can kind of squish them into a single for all by using a number to code a pair of numbers. I haven't gone into this in too much detail, but using the usual coding tricks, you can code a number as a pair of numbers. And so every sequence of for all x, y, z, w, you can squash those into a single for all if you want to. So it doesn't really make sense to count the number of the same quantifier, but it does make sense to count when it swaps, when it goes from a for all to an exists, or when it goes from an exists to a for all. And that's what the arithmetic hierarchy, or generally the quantifier alternation number, tries to encode. It says, hey, here's a proposition. Using very simple logical operations, I can push the quantifiers to the front. When I do that, there's an alternation of for alls and exists. And that number, that alternation, is hard to get rid of. It's either there or it's not there. And the number of quantifier swaps that's there seems kind of immutable. And generally, if it starts with a for all and then alternates, 2 or 3 times, if it alternates 3 times, we say that's a pi 3 sentence, right? And if it starts with an exists and it alternates twice, say, we say that's a sigma 2 sentence, right? That's because a pi is a product, and product is somehow related to for all in ways that I will not explain at this point. And a sigma is like a sum, somehow that's related to exists. Again, I'm not going to explain that too much. But what I am going to try and explain is, what does this number really mean? Roughly, this number quantifies the complexity of your sentence, right? We've seen, and referenced in many episodes that there are some sentences that you can express in piano arithmetic, but the piano arithmetic doesn't have the logical strength to prove. All right, that is the essence of the incompleteness theorem. We even have an example of such a sentence, right? One such sentence is piano arithmetic is consistent, right? That sentence saying that this logic PA is consistent itself can be encoded somehow into arithmetic, but it can't be proven. All right, well, what's the complexity of that sentence? Generally, and this is a point I don't want to go into too much detail, but generally people want to ignore bounded quantifiers, right? If you want to say a number P is prime, you don't want to say that's a quantified statement, right? If you want to say, what's a prime number? 37, is that prime? I don't know. If you want to say 37 is prime, what you want to say is for all numbers less than 37, if it divides 37, then it's either 1 or it's 37, right? But that's a bounded quantifier. So in some sense, you want to say, oh, well, this is just a big or, right? It's just a finite number of things I need to check because I know what its bound is, 37, right? People call those bounded quantifiers, and those generally do not count towards the complexity of the sentence. So saying 37 is prime isn't a pi 1 sentence, right? It's just 0, right? There are no quantifiers there. I'm just stating a fact that is true or not true. Okay, so great. So we have an example of something that PA can't decide. What is the complexity of that thing? Well, what does it say? It says, hey, piano arithmetic cannot prove, what is proving consistency of Peano arithmetic mean, right? It's a certain sentence, and that sentence is for every x, if x is the code of a proof in Peano arithmetic, well, that is not a proof of false, right? It's not a proof of 0 equals 1. That's what it means to be consistent. It's saying every proof in that system is not a proof of a contradictory statement. In particular, 0 equals 1. This particular 0 equals 1 contradictory statement. All right, but that is a proof of 0 equals 1. That's a bounded quantifier statement, right? So here we're at 0, saying for a specific x is not the proof of 0 equals 1. That's 0. And then you're saying for every x that is the case. So actually, consistency of arithmetic is only pi 1. All right? That's kind of cool. It's saying already at the first level, there are things that you can't prove, right? The very simplest level. You might say, well, okay, we're saying that that's the simplest level, but maybe that's the same as all levels, right? What does that mean? That means essentially it could be the case that if we knew how to solve every single pi 1 statement, we had some magic genie that told us, you give it a pi 1 statement, it's like, oh yes, this one's true, this one's false. Well, maybe if we had that magic genie, we could solve pi 2 sentences and actually pi, n sentences for every n. Well, okay, it's pretty easy to prove that actually, no, that's not the case. Even if you had a magical genie that told you the answers to all pi 1 sentences, there would still be pi 2 sentences that you wouldn't be able to solve. That's kind of fascinating, I think. This is, let's see. I don't think I will give an example of that, but it is sort of easy to construct sentences by fiat, right? You say, oh, well, here's a sentence that's pi 2 that you definitely can't solve, if you have this genie for pi 1 sentences. And basically the pi 2 sentences is, it's like a Gödel sentence for a system with that genie. It's basically saying, hey, I am not true. I'm true. Let's see. I am not provable even with a genie, right? It's this sort of diagonalization trick. And this diagonalization trick, you can do it specially. You can basically run through, this Gödel incompleteness proof and use the genie from the previous level to show that each of these levels is actually separate. Each level, right? You have this pi 1 level that already can talk about consistency, but each level is harder and harder and harder. I think that's kind of cool. To tease the next episode, let me just say one thing. We have examples of interesting statements that are at higher levels, but most of our open conjectures are really, really hard arithmetic problems, like the existence of odd perfect numbers, or are there infinitely many Mersenne primes? All of those really, really hard questions that are very tantalizing because they're simple to explain are actually pi 1 sentences. So that's kind of fascinating, right? There aren't any easy examples of really hard problems that are higher up in the hierarchy. And I think that's not because there aren't hard problems. It's just because those problems, just to understand what they say, is a little bit harder. So they're a little bit less appealing to the masses. People have worked a little bit less hard on them because they're less intuitively true. However, we do have many theorems that go up into this hierarchy. All right, I'm going to stop for now, and I hope to talk more about this in the near future. Until then, do take care.